Hello and welcome to Trustworthy AI, De-risk Business Adoption of AI. And today I'm talking to Dr. David Bray, and our topic is Trustworthy Generative AI Leadership Readiness. Um, a few words about Dr. Bray. He has an extensive experience in technology and government. He is a champion of positive change and a leading voice on technology's impact across government and business alike. Dr. Bray is with the nonpartisan group called Stimson Center. And one thing that I think is really appropriate for today's conversation in his background is his passion that includes complicated, near impossible missions involving humans and technology in challenging circumstances. We are in a very unprecedented and unknown in some ways when it comes to risks around and the operating environment, the future around AI. So I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Dr. Abre, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Pamela, and thanks for everything you do as well as a champion of positive change agents. And it's great to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bray, I'd like to kind of get your feeling and your perspective on where we are with what is the adoption that we need to do around AI, and is it something that we can adopt without looking at other unintended consequences or other fallouts, etc., that may come along with the benefits? Do you think we are at the point where we have solved for all the risks that can come from AI?
Well, I appreciate that setup, and I would say, obviously, yes, we are in an era in which we are just now beginning to see the ripple effects, not just of the latest wave of generative AI, but AI in some respects. I like to remind people is a technology that goes back to the late 1950s and has had multiple waves, including expert systems, decision support systems, natural language processing. And in fact, right now, the current wave of generative AI is using algorithms that were initially pioneered in the late 80s. And they're only possible now because of one, advances in computing. We now have cloud compute and enough cycles to do this. And also because we've all used the internet over the last 25 to 30 years, that's created enough data sets that we can do it. And if we even had had the computing power in the 1980s, we wouldn't have had the data per se. So if we look at what happened with the internet and recognizing it's been a 50 plus year endeavor, there are clearly still third, fourth order effects that we are still just beginning to make sense of. I mean, I know you do a lot with cybersecurity and trying to help people understand the need to address, to be ahead of the risk of cybersecurity. We should be assuming that as we adopt these new technologies, there's going to be other both vulnerabilities as well as benefits, and that the truth is going to be somewhere in between. There's a lot of excessive hype out there, not all of which is grounded in reality, but also there's a whole lot of doomism that I'm like, I really don't necessarily see that either. I think the truth is in the middle. And so, of course, is the question of how do we help people move forward? How do we help boards? How do we help CEOs not be paralyzed by saying, I'm not going to do anything, or I'm just going to wait till someone else does something? Because if you're in business, that's usually a recipe for falling behind fast, and not only fast, but faster behind. And at the same time, not rush so far that they end up on a limb that breaks and then bad things happen. And one of the things I try to repeat to people is a need to be mindful of why are we here? And if you can go back to the business case, whether you're in actual business or government, then you can begin to say, what are the right tools and approaches that both I'm using today, as well as I want to advance possibly using AI? And then what flavors of AI? Is it generative AI? Is it a different type of AI? Maybe I'm in a world in which the past is not predictive of the present and future. Well, if so, then deep learning may not be right for you, because if your present and future is regularly changing and you're reliant on past data sets, you may find that actually past data sets hold you back from seeing the future in ways that you need to. Whereas if you're in a world that's not changing that much, then it may be perfect. And so going back to why are we here allows you then to figure out what's the right tools, what are things that maybe you aren't doing that you can do little pivot projects to begin to explore. and then do them more as calculated bets as you move forward, being mindful that yes, there may be things that you aren't expecting or not expecting to see in a way that is both reasoned and rationed, and also keeping you on the edge of what things do I need to retire? Because that's the other question a lot of times we don't ask is, and from cybersecurity, legacy IT can quickly become your biggest vulnerability if the system's 10 to 15 to 20 years old because it will not have the modern day cybersecurity practices. I submit the same thing is probably true for organizations if they're not using more advanced approaches to understanding data and getting insights, they too will fall behind.
That's really interesting. Really, one comment I do want to make though is I think cybersecurity is really not even enough to secure AI. So 5 years ago, I'd done a pivot to trustworthiness, and as you know, trustworthiness is something really important to business. But when it comes to AI, there are components such as security and privacy, and those things that are those elements that are risks that are unique to AI, such as explainability and transparency, for example. So, having said that and taking that into account, and what you said about the readiness for the business based on the way they have been doing things, and also the context, right? If it is changing, then maybe the historical data may not be that important in shaping the future and adopting AI, for example. So keeping that in mind, that trust is important for business. Data is also very important, and the operating environment. So it's not just let's just use the data and let's use AI to leverage the data that we have. And to your point, what is the strategy, right? How it's not leading out with we have the data, let's make something of it. It's where do you want to go and what kind of data do you have, and also what are the risks that are going to come to the business from adopting this really high impact and dynamic technology. What would you say to a business leader, the board, for example, or the CEOs that around that, that so that they understand that it is not just business as usual. This is not just another technology, for example.
Right. So I'd say three things. The first is I would one thank you for everything you're doing with trustworthy AI. I think you were ahead of your time, and I'm glad you're carrying the flag. I would also point to an article that Ray Wong of Constellation Research and myself did in 2019. Again, we were also kind of
Yeah.
ahead of our time on people-centered approaches to deep learning, which I realize probably most people at the time weren't even thinking about it, but we were sort of like what you were saying, which is data, data, data. And I realize right now with all the conversation about AI, it's very attractive to leap to the AI part and not say first, is my data robust enough to even answer the questions I'm trying to? How do I know if it's representative enough? It might be that I actually am not representing certain populations, or I'm representing certain concerns. And so I'll ask things in my data and unfortunately discover that I have inadequate data to do so in a way that's fair or just. And so that MIT article we did with MIT Sloan said, one, you need to have an always ongoing human and machine process that's saying, is our data still relevant of the questions we're trying to ask, or has it fallen behind? And if so, how do we adjust it? And it's not about removing, the trouble is a lot of people talk about how can we remove bias? Well, if you start removing data, that itself introduces some bias. It's more being aware of when the data is inadequate or when it may no longer be representative. And we intentionally want it to have a naysayer function. And the naysayer function might say, you know, let's play devil's advocate. What if the data is wrong? What if the data is inaccurate? What if it's imprecise? Or even worse, what if we're in a competitive market commercially, or we're in a competitive market in terms of a nation, and someone is poisoning our data? And so just being aware of that. So that's the first thing is data, 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 and being aware of the importance of governance around it to be mindful of, is the data appropriate for the questions you're trying to ask using whatever tool, AI tool you're trying to do. The second thing I would point out is being mindful of the fact that you've got to involve people in AI. I talk about it's like deployment empathy, that you can't just roll it out and expect that people are going to adopt it. If anything, people may feel a little threatened. There's been a whole lot of news articles that have talked about how it's going to outsource jobs. Truth again is somewhere in the middle, or not exactly at the extremes. but having the empathy of the human side, and also being very cautious that we humans may risk anthropomorphizing the machine when in fact the machine is nothing like us. I mean,
Mm.
you know, as much as people say the machine is thinking like a human, you look at the massive power consumption right now of generative AI, and you compare that to the fact that our human brains are anywhere between 15 and 20 watts, where these things are 5,000, if not 25,000 watts for a data center. I often say you should, instead of calling AI artificial intelligence, we should call it alien interactions, because it's not at all like us. It may, again, it's been tuned and harmonized to appear human-like, but the way it's reaching its conclusions, no 4-year-old would look at the letter A million times before it would finally figure out the letter A. And so maybe we'll eventually develop other approaches. Active inference is one that Carl Frisson and others are doing, but helping the board understand that this is a tool, but to be very cautious of the human side of it. And when you do deployment empathy, I actually, you talked about trust. I say we should be mindful of three things, which is trust can be defined as the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of an actor we cannot directly control. That could be a human actor, that could be an organizational actor, it could be a government, but it could also be a machine. And the research shows humans are willing to trust and be vulnerable if they perceive benevolence, perceive competence, and they perceive integrity on the part of the actor. Now, the key thing is perceived, because in addition to trustworthy AI in the world we're in, it's getting easier more than ever, unfortunately, whether you call it disinformation or inaccurate information out there that might hit your company's brand, your reputation. And the trouble is then, of course, now you're in a battle of, is this true or not? And that's exactly what the internet likes to sort of inflame. It's a challenge of being aware that trust is also about perceptions, and how does one get ahead of those perceptions before a bad day happens. And then finally, I guess the last thing I would say is it's about leadership, and that leadership is different than management. Management is when you meet expectations. We all need to meet expectations to a degree. But if all the company does is meet expectations, whether it's of their shareholders, of the board, or whatever, will increasingly fall behind. And so how can the board, how can the CEO create an environment where we have high expectations? However, we're also always looking for everyone in the organization to look out of ways to step outside of the status quo, even if we're like, that's uncomfortable, or why are we doing this? To have enough latitude to both meet expectations, but also step outside of expectations. Because if all the company does is meet expectations in our rapidly changing world, that is a surefire recipe for falling behind. And so that leadership quotient, along with the deployment empathy, along with a people-centered approach to data and AI, that to me is a recipe for success.
Well, that's a lot to digest. So thank you. Let me just ask one question, which
Sure.
is as a response to that, and then we'll ask you the next one. In terms of readiness, how does one make an organization ready for putting those outlines in place for data, understanding your data? I mean, who in the organization do you think should be involved in those conversations to understand what kind of data is there? Is the organization going to have these things for implementing, for example, the empathy component that you mentioned, right? Uh, all the things that you mentioned, how do you see that becoming actionable, right? For example.
So I tend to go to places that are on fire, for better or for worse, because then you've got the urgent, you've got the
Mhm.
urgent imperative. It's, organizations that are doing okay enough, it's hard to sort of say we need to do things differently and better because things feel okay enough. And so when I parachute into organizations that are on fire, one time I went into Afghanistan in 2009 and was basically traveling underneath Secretary of Defense travel orders to identify problems saying there were problems yet impossible solutions. Um, I go in and I start asking questions. I'm like, how are things going? What are we doing well on? What are we not doing well on? And I'm just sort of like listening over the first 2 to 3 weeks, because I believe, if you're trying to identify exactly what you said, which is who are the right people, the data, and everything like that, it takes some time to explore. And similarly, when I went to the Federal Communications Commission, they'd had 9 permanent or acting CIOs in 8 years prior to my arrival, which is just a
Wow.
sure sign that CIO number 10, things are just going great. And obviously, there was a lot of change fatigue. There's a lot of frustration. And the other thing I found is sometimes the people who you really want to talk to are so busy or are so almost shell shocked by the by the frustrations of the past. You have to uncover them. They're not coming to you. You have to actually go seek them out. And so I oftentimes I ask, who else should I talk to? Over time, though, you're building a theory of the case, and you're using questions to sort of say, how are things going? What are we excited about? And really, what your goal is both identifying who's going to be people that are going to be willing to be early adopters, who are going to be people that are going to wait and see for some early wins. There may even be some people that'll lag and just say, look, I'm tired. I'm not sure it's going to move forward. And begin to do the journey of converting people from what I would call problem holders or problem admirers to problem solvers. Because if it's just you trying to solve these problems, it's not going to scale. It's not going to last. It's not going to be institutional. And it's also a challenge of trust. So one of the questions I always like to ask people is, what brings you joy? And they're like, why is a technologist asking me that? Well, one, because we're human. And two, if I understand what brings you joy at work, if I can link something we have to have done to something you're intrinsically excited about, like it's a win-win for everybody, like you're moving forward. So I would say on data, it's oftentimes the people with the business need, but also the people that may be involved in the collection, as well as enough, dare I say, divergent thinking to challenge the status quo. Sometimes I intentionally bring in people from the outside, but I tell them, look, have empathy for people on the inside. They've been doing this for a while, because I see times where you end up with clicks, and that's not a good thing. I say it's one team, one mission. We're striving to figure out how to get the job done in a way that is better and different, and to manage the friction of moving from what we're doing to where we're going, and recognizing that may be a continuous journey. Like where we're going may be continuous improvement, not an end state. So I hope that helps. But again, I would say the best approach that you can do to figuring out who the right people are, and the right alignment of data and people is be curious and be questioning.
So let's switch to the other side, which is those who are forging ahead, right? And for example, organizations are increasingly prioritizing value propositions from generative AI, for example, and demanding that we see, they see results. And how realistic is that to kind of take that kind of a approach? What needs to go behind? What is some of the prep work required in order? I guess another way of rephrasing the question is, what are some of the surefire or things that will increase that success coming from generative AI in an organization? Because there are those who are going on, charging full ahead, those who are kind of that we're never going to do this. But then it's that how do you drive that balance of tempering, enthusiasm with what is the reality, right, within the organization? Is your governance ready? Is your um, business strategy aligned with what you're looking to do? Can you comment a little bit about what you see as a way of driving success in there?
Yeah, so I think it is. It's yeah. When I meet with boards, I often first level set and say, look, there's been different flavors of AI. Let's talk about generative AI in particular. It's really good at pattern matching in ways that can be conversational. They can produce images. They can produce even audio and video as a way of interacting with humans. And it's pattern matching. And the better your data, the better the pattern matching. But it's not, as far as the latest papers from Neuro IPS and the other AI conferences can say, it's not what people really say thinking like us. It doesn't have a sense of abstract concepts. And so, in terms of aligning it to business needs, I often say identify your top 3 to 5 business priorities where, if it was better customer engagement or better employee engagement or partnership relationships, and we had an improvement there, because right now you're drowning in too many interactions or too many pings, you can't make a sense of where do I need to put my best humans on this. That's probably where you're looking to use generative AI at the moment. Or if you're in a field in which you can use past data to generate present and future either videos or images or audios, and that's of use, then that's also a path. And so to lay the seeds of success, again, first identify the business priorities, then map out where are we currently deficient. Is it taking us 3 to 4 weeks to do something, and our goal is to get it down to 2 to 3 days, or even 2 to 3 hours. And once we have that as the milestone of what we're trying to do, we're trying to shorten the time, or we're trying to increase. Right now our customers or our clients say they 40% are happy about their interactions with us. Can we get up to 75 or 80%? Then you can begin to figure out how do you align the data and the tech towards that process, or that whatever metric improvement you're trying to do. And right now, I'll give a specific example. I'm a big believer that the future of interactions will not be through websites. We may actually look back at web pages; they'll still be there, but just like how some of us still remember the rotary phones where you actually had to spin the dials and you had that. Web pages might be like that, 15 or so years from now, and instead it's going to be conversations either through texting, an actual audio conversation, speaking a language, and in particular in industries like insurance, industries like government, or anywhere where you have to fill out a lot of forms. The optimal way that generative AI could be used is, instead of having to know what form to fill out and even filling out the form, if you have a text or a verbal conversation with the machine and say, look, I'm trying to apply for the following thing, or I'm trying to get the following service done, it actually helps figure out, one, the right forms for you, and two, auto populates it for you, and then gives you confirmation. Because it's been shown, for example, if somebody can get a yes or no answer about a claim or about something they're trying to do in less than 2 weeks, even if it's a no, they're happier than if it's a yes 6 months from now. And so there's ways you can delight your customers and do your business by increasing the speed at which you respond, decreasing that sort of cycle time. And that's where I think generative AI can really play a role, because again, it's really good at pattern matching. And if we can actually do it so you no longer have to fill out forms, if you can have conversations as a way of interacting and have that replace web pages, that gets exciting.
Yes, I like that. I love that analogy and the example you gave. I had not thought of that at all. So I think that's that's exciting. I think it's certainly speaks to why we should adopt and why we should go ahead, but take a look at our readiness. How are we going to achieve this? Because it can only get better and better, right? The way I see it, and I correct me, if you think that's not accurate, but the way I see it is, if we lay the right foundation within a company where we have mastered, what is our value proposition, what is our data, how do we understand the risks that are there that can come from that. But if you put the right foundation in compliance, security, governance, etc., then it is something that you can only, you don't have to go back and rebuild. You can just lay the foundation with a foundation model, no pun intended, and just go further and further in terms of the value prop, right? What can be achieved. So there's a lot to look forward to. And obviously, the more prepared we are, the better and more we can achieve with it. I think I don't know if you certainly discussed a lot of things and we discussed a lot of things. Is there anything you'd like to conclude with, Dr. Gray?
Sure. Well, first, I think you're spot on. Is It's about laying the good foundation and linking it to why are we here and our values. I would say just one final note for companies that are looking at this is, be ready for the fact that we're in an era in which change management is going to be increasingly important, whether it's change management for data and AI. But let's face it, quantum computing could be anywhere between 3 to 5 years and having impacts as well. Already, we're talking about the need to shift to quantum resistant algorithms and
Mhm.
encryption as a way to actually sort of resist your data being decrypted sometime in the future. There's commercialization of space. Right now, Argentina recently approved collection at 0.125 meter resolution commercially. So if you are, as a company,
Mhm.
you're not thinking about what does it mean to actually, one, have your competitors possibly seeing what you're doing from space, but then two, how to use that, that's something you need to do as well. And so, we a lot of us that have done technology might think about the era where we went from client servers, and then came the internet, and that was about 8 years. And then after the internet and the web, then there came cloud computing, and some companies are still catching up with cloud, but each was about 10 to 8 years of generations. That's not the the future ahead for us. Now it's going to be different waves, both of different flavors of AI. We may find that deep learning is replaced with active inference in 1 or 2 or 3 years. There's going to be advances there. Quantum computing, space, bio. We haven't even talked about bio. And so it's really about sort of how do you warm up your company, being true to its why it's there and its value proposition, to be in a place where it's both meeting expectations but not resting on its laurels, because the simultaneous waves of disruption are all hitting us all together at increasing frequency.
Thank you. I think everybody is trying to manage. To your point, there's a difference between management and leadership, which I really like that delineation that you called out. Manage and lead with AI. So I'm hoping these are going to be really important things for them to consider as they do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. And I really appreciate this. And as always, as I like to encourage people, please be bold, please be brave, and most importantly, please be benevolent.
Oh, I like that so much. Thank you.
Thank you.